Can you truly wrap your mind around this? In the heart of modern Beijing, a city throbbing with 22 million souls, 6 concentric rings of relentless highways, and a subway system that transports more passengers than the entire population of some nations, there exists a secret that forces the world to stop and stare. Standing solitary amidst a maelstrom of metal and exhaust is a 500-year-old Ming dynasty gate tower. It stands like a grizzled, weary warrior, enduring a storm of steel. How did this ancient relic survive the encroaching sea of concrete? More importantly, how did a forgotten military outpost on the edge of the bitter northern steppes rise to become one of the greatest cities in human history, enduring fire, conquest, revolution, and systematic destruction for over 3 millennia? What you are about to hear will do more than just inform you. It will shock you. It will stir your heart and fundamentally alter your perception of human resilience. But this is merely the prologue. The true secrets, the twists that will leave you breathless, are waiting just ahead. Stay with me until the final second, because every chapter of this saga contains a revelation you won't see coming. The deeper we go, the more you will realize that this isn't just history, it is a living, breathing lesson in grit that we desperately need to pass on to the next generation. Beijing today is a behemoth. It is loud, restless, and colossal. Yet, if you were to zoom in from the heavens, past the shimmering glass skyscrapers and the neon arteries of the highways, past the labyrinthine times, Hutong's times, and the sun-drenched saffron walls of the Forbidden City, you would stumble upon an anomaly. That lone Ming tower, anchored like a massive boulder in the middle of a rushing river. How did it get there? The better question, and the one that yields a far more jarring answer, is this. How did a neglected garrison town at the edge of the wilderness transform into a global titan that outlived every empire that tried to claim it? To find out, we must peel back the layers of time. What you are about to witness is nothing short of miraculous. Imagine a capital abandoned almost overnight. Imagine a Mongol conqueror who, instead of raised earth, built the world's largest planned megacity on top of ruins. Think of a dynasty that encased its heart in 60 kilometers of impenetrable stone, only to have the next regime tear it down in a heartbeat. Think of a population explosion that no one saw coming. These are but the opening notes of a much grander symphony. Roughly 3,000 years ago, during the Western Zhou period, there was a small, walled settlement nestled in a bend of a river where the flat North China Plain begins to wrinkle into mountains. It wasn't grand. It consisted of low, rammed earth walls, wooden halls, and fields of millet stretching toward the riverbanks. At dusk, the scent of cooking fires drifted across the open steppe, flanked by forested hills to the north and the endless, wind-swept plains beyond. This was the city of Ji. It was the regional capital of the state of Yuan, the oldest confirmed urban settlement beneath modern Beijing. Back then, it wasn't the center of anything. It was a frontier outpost, a jagged fingernail of power scratching at the northern wilds, managing the volatile boundary between the settled world of the farmer and the vast, nomadic world of the horseman. But don't be fooled by its humble start. This unimportant location held a geographical secret that would eventually redirect the course of human history. In the 3rd century BC, the Qin state swept through the Warring States period like a wildfire, unifying China under its first emperor. Ji was swallowed up, relegated to a mere provincial center. The walls remained, and the people stayed, but its political soul vanished. It became a border garrison, a place the empire kept, but never truly invested in. This was the first great surprise of Beijing's life. For nearly 1,000 years after unification, it remained a backwater. The great seats of power, the glittering capitals of the Qin and Han, lay far to the south and west in the Yellow River Basin. This northern corner was useful, yes, but ordinary. What kept it alive was the cold logic of the map. The mountains to the north funneled all movement through a handful of narrow passes. Whoever held the plain below those passes held the keys to the entire northern frontier. As empires rose and fell, the logic of the location remained undeniable. By the time of the Han dynasty, 2,000 years ago, the settlement was renamed Yuzhou. It functioned as a military nerve center and a supply hub, anchoring the northern defenses. If you had stood at the southern gate at dawn, historians believe you would have witnessed two entirely different worlds colliding in a single marketplace. Inside the walls, the orderly grid of administrative streets and the rhythmic curve of Chinese wooden roof tiles. Outside the walls, a high-tension zone of tethered horses and foreign traders, dressed in heavy furs, bartering hides, livestock, and dried meats. The pungent scent of tanned leather and hay mingled with the charcoal smoke from the city's hearths. Yuzhou changed hands incessantly as China fractured after the fall of the Han. During the northern dynasties, from the 4th to the 6th centuries, it was ruled by non-Han dynasties, Xianbei confederations, and various steppe groups. Each wave left a different architectural fingerprint, a different weave of people, and a different network of trade. The fascinating thing about this era is that the city did not shrink during the chaos. Evidence suggests it actually thrived economically because it sat at the intersection of rival powers. When two giants border each other, the boundary becomes a marketplace. Merchants don't care about political unity, they care about access. Yuzhou provided it. The city was learning a vital survival skill, how to absorb a conqueror rather than just resist him, and how to keep the gears of commerce turning even as the flag atop the gate tower changed colors. That skill would prove priceless for the next 2 millennia. Then came the Tang dynasty, and Yuzhou grew even larger. The Tang were grand imperialists, and they expanded the city with a familiar confidence. They laid out wider grids and markets. Buddhist temples with distinct, sweeping eaves began to define the skyline of East Asian urbanism. Garrison soldiers in layered, lacquered armor drilled on the parade grounds north of the walls. The city was still secondary to the great capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang, but it was sturdy, self-assured, and acutely aware of its strategic worth. But then, an explosion of violence from within this very city nearly toppled the entire empire. Can you believe it? The rebellion struck in 755 AD. A general named An Lushan, who commanded a massive army from this very city, launched an uprising that shook the foundations of the Tang. The conflict lasted nearly a decade, devouring the heart of the empire and permanently shifting the balance of power between the central government and regional commanders. Yuzhou had just proven, at a staggering cost, exactly what was at stake when someone controlled the northern gates. The rebellion was eventually crushed, and Tang authority was restored, but the world had changed. A century later, a warlord named Liu Rengong seized the region, ruling it as a semi-independent kingdom, with Yuzhou as its crown jewel. Historians believe the city's population actually surged after the An Lushan rebellion, bolstered by refugees fleeing the scorched earth of the south and east. Crisis, strangely, made the border city larger. This pattern instability at the center, benefiting the periphery, would repeat time and again. The city had taught the empire a bitter lesson. Whoever holds this ground can threaten everything south of the mountains. By the 10th century, the Tang had collapsed, and a new gallery of powers fought for the north. The Liao dynasty, ruled by the Khitan people from the steppes, seized the city and made a fate-altering decision. They designated it as their secondary capital. Now called Nanjing, the southern capital of the Liao system, the city began to receive the investment befitting royalty. Green glazed roof tiles began to shimmer in the distance. Wide ceremonial boulevards were paved. Imperial buildings rose audience halls, treasuries, and administrative blocks built of permanent stone and brick. The nomadic tents of the past were gone forever. A century later, the Jurchen-led Jin dynasty overthrew the Liao and upgraded the city once more, renaming it Zhongdu, the central capital, and vastly expanding its walls. This was the moment, in the early 12th century, when the location finally began to function as an imperial seat rather than a mere outpost. The city finally possessed an ambition that matched its geography. But in 1215, the world changed. Genghis Khan arrived. The Mongol siege of Zhongdu ended as Mongol sieges usually did. The city fell. The Jin court had already fled south. Contemporary accounts describe a pall of smoke hanging over the ruins for weeks. But here is the first major surprise. The destruction, though horrific, was surgical. The Mongols torched the palace complex, the symbol of their enemy's power, but they spared much of the residential and commercial districts. They needed a functioning urban hub, not a pile of ash. The bones of the city survived. While most conquerors would have moved on to richer prizes in the south, the Mongols had a different plan entirely. You might think the city was destined to be erased from the map. Wait, because what happened next is truly staggering. A generation later, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history, made a decision that would dictate the next 800 years. He would build a brand new capital, slightly to the north of the Jin ruins. He would build it from scratch, according to a master plan, all at once. Historical reconstructions show an impossibly ambitious grid. Boulevards were wide enough for 9 chariots to ride abreast. A colossal palace complex sat at the center, anchored by man-made lakes. The markets were choked with goods from across Eurasia. On any given street, you might pass Persian merchants, Central Asian craftsmen, Tibetan monks, European travelers, Chinese scholars, and Mongol officials, all moving through the same space. It was perhaps the most multicultural city on earth. Great drum and bell towers rose to mark the center, regulating time for the entire urban grid. The crucial point for us is this. The logic of the main streets in central Beijing today, the north-south orientation, and the primary avenues, still follows the ghost of this Mongol master plan. The Yuan dynasty built the skeleton that every subsequent version of the city would fill. At its peak, Khanbalik was likely the largest city in the world. Then, the Yuan collapsed. Plague, economic depression, and peasant revolts converged in the mid-14th century. The last Yuan emperor fled north in 1368. Ming forces marched in and systematically dismantled the Mongol palace system. Within a generation, the center of the world's greatest city was a landscape of rubble. The international networks snapped. The Ming were left with a ghost capital. What would they do with it? The answer, eventually, was everything. The Yongle emperor, who seized the throne through a bloody civil war and moved the capital from Nanjing back to Beijing around 1421, understood that he needed this city to be in time's argument. An argument that he was the legitimate ruler. An argument that the North could be held. An argument written in stone, brick, and lacquer on a scale that could not be ignored. Imagine the city's outskirts in 1410. Brick kilns burned day and night in every direction, their smoke visible for miles. Millions of bricks moved by water along the newly dredged Grand Canal toward the construction sites. The rhythmic clink of stone chisels and the thud of hammers echoed from the site of what would become the Forbidden City. The result was a palace complex of nearly 1,000 rooms, surrounded by its own wall, then the Imperial City Wall, then the Inner City Wall, and finally, the Outer City Wall. These concentric rings of power eventually encompassed some 60 kilometers of fortifications. The Forbidden City was completed around 1420. Tiananmen Gate rose in its original form. And those walls, those massive, soaring walls, became the defining statement of the city. They were the face it showed the world, the thing you saw before you saw anything else. What is often forgotten is that Beijing was not an obvious choice for a permanent capital. The original Ming capital was Nanjing, much further south and far more prosperous. Many emperors after Yongle considered moving back. The decision to stay in Beijing was controversial, ruinously expensive, and never entirely settled. The city's status was not an inevitability. It was a contested, high-stakes gamble, encased in stone. The walls were up, the palaces were done. Now the city had to fill itself and learn to live within its own grand narrative. By the mid-15th century, Beijing had evolved into something more complex than a single city. It was a layered system, a series of concentric worlds, each with its own rules and rhythms. At the center, nearly invisible to the public, was the Forbidden City, where the emperor and his court lived in total isolation. Beyond that was the Imperial City, a restricted domain of administrative eunuchs and palace suppliers. Further out was the Inner City, a tidy grid of official residences, incense-heavy Buddhist and Taoist temples, pharmacies, and military barracks. And from the 1550s onward, There was the outer city, to the south, louder, denser, and more vibrant than the inner city ever dared to be. If you wanted to understand Ming Beijing, you went to the outer city. That was the realm of temple fairs, silk and lacquer workshops, open-air operas, and food stalls thick with smoke, noise, and crowds. The winter air was heavy with the smell of coal smoke. Beijing sits in a shallow basin, and the smog would settle over the rooftops. The outer city wall itself was one of history's great unfinished projects. It was supposed to wrap around the entire inner city in a perfect loop, but the money ran out. Only the southern portion was finished, giving Beijing the distinct inverted T-shape it held for centuries. A rectangular northern section with a squarish southern section attached below. A financial embarrassment at the time, it accidentally became a geographical identity that lasted 500 years. By the early 17th century, however, the dynasty that built all of this had exhausted its ability to maintain it. Financial collapse, factional paralysis at court, and a catastrophic drought across northern China in the 1630s created a pressure that no wall could contain. In 1644, the rebel leader Li Zicheng marched into Beijing. The last Ming emperor climbed a hill just outside the Forbidden City and never came down. Li Zicheng's victory lasted only weeks before an army from beyond the walls arrived. The Manchu forces of the Qing entered Beijing in 1644, and the first thing they did was carve the city in two. The inner city was reorganized by clan. The Manchu 8-banner garrisons took over the north, each banner assigned to a specific sector, each with its own hierarchy and identity. The Han Chinese population was forcibly relocated to the outer city. Evidence suggests this displacement was managed rather than purely chaotic, but it was systematic. A 24-hour city was reorganized in a few years into what looked like two cities sharing a wall. Tibetan Buddhist temples began to appear around the imperial city, material evidence of the Qing strategy. They weren't just rulers of China, but patrons of a Buddhist world stretching from Mongolia to Tibet. The Yonghe Temple, converted from a prince's palace into a national lamasery, stands today as the clearest physical statement of that ambition. Equally important was what the Qing times didn't do. They did not destroy the Forbidden City. They walked into the Ming palaces, rearranged the furniture to suit their ritual calendars, and kept the structure intact. Continuity was their argument. We do not destroy what came before us, we absorb it. It worked. By the early 18th century, the population had exploded, and Beijing was once again one of the world's premier cities, likely the largest. The walls enclosed a functioning multicultural metropolis trading in silk, porcelain, medicine, grain, and ideas. Then came the sea, not literally, but via the ships and the powers that steered them, a world that demanded China join on terms China did not choose. The 19th century in Beijing is a story we can see with painful clarity because photography arrived in the 1860s, and the photos are haunting. You can see the canal systems silting up. The outer city walls show years of deferred maintenance, with weeds sprouting from the battlements. The Yuan, the old summer palace, northwest of the walls, was considered one of the world's wonders before 1860. It was a sprawling masterpiece of European-style Baroque pavilions, blended with traditional Chinese landscapes. In the autumn of 1860, British and French troops burned it to the ground. The first photographs of the ruins, broken marble columns and stone arches standing silent in overgrown grass, are among the most soul-crushing images in Chinese history. Those ruins remain there today, preserved exactly as they fell. In 1900, a multinational coalition occupied Beijing following the Boxer Uprising. Foreign troops camped inside the Forbidden City. Empress Dowager Cixi fled to the west, disguised as a peasant. The occupation lasted over a year. Following this came the establishment of the Legation Quarter, a strip of foreign-controlled territory running east from Tiananmen. It was lined with European-style buildings, consulates, banks, and churches surrounded by its own walls, where Chinese citizens were not free to enter. It was a city within a city, built by people who came uninvited and stayed. The dynasty survived the occupation, but it could not survive the decade. In 1912, the last Qing emperor abdicated, ending 2,000 years of imperial tradition. The walls were still standing, but the world they protected had vanished forever. For the next 35 years, Beijing would struggle to remember what it was meant to be. In 1928, the city was renamed Beiping Northern Peace, as the nationalist government shifted the capital south to Nanjing. For the first time since the Ming dynasty, the city was stripped of its political primacy, left to linger as a ghost of its former self. Yet, life on the streets took on a new, frantic energy. The imperial ceremonial routes, once meticulously swept and cleared of commoners whenever the emperor traveled, were now overtaken by the joyful collision of modern life. The rhythmic clatter of rickshaws and the sharp ring of electric trams filled the air where silence had once been law. In 1925, a threshold was crossed that would have been unthinkable just a generation prior. The Forbidden City, sealed off from the public for 5 centuries, was transformed into the Palace Museum. The great gates swung wide. Courtyards that had been the exclusive stage for celestial rituals were suddenly flooded with ordinary citizens, wandering through spaces they had been told were forbidden to their very eyes. It is a moment worth pausing to consider. 500 years of taboo vanished in an afternoon. To see the Son of Heaven's private world become a public park was no small transition. It was a psychological earthquake. Then came 1937. The rising sun flag was hoisted over the gate towers, and Japanese sentries took their posts. Food grew scarce, and a heavy, crushing silence descended, not the explosive destruction of a siege, but the slow, agonizing suffocation of a city administered by a foreign military for 8 long years. There was, however, a strange irony to this dark chapter. The Japanese occupation, while brutal in human terms, left Beijing's physical skeleton largely intact. The conquerors wanted a functioning administrative hub, not a pile of rubble. It was one of the few transitions of power in the city's long history that did not involve significant architectural destruction. The walls stood, the temples stood. The hutongs times those intricate patterns of alleyways and courtyard houses that had evolved since the Yuan dynasty and were refined through the Ming and Qing, remained the living tissue of the city. When the war finally ended in 1945, a brief respite followed, only to be swallowed by a civil war that would decide what kind of city Beijing was destined to become. The answer arrived in 1949 with a speed and consequence that dwarfed everything before it. On the 1st of October, 1949, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed from atop Tiananmen Gate, the same gate used for imperial edicts by the Ming, paraded through by the Qing, and occupied by foreign powers. The symbolism was entirely intentional. What followed was the most transformative physical metamorphosis the city had seen since the days of Kublai Khan. The Tiananmen Square of 1949 was not the vast, open expanse we see today. It was a more enclosed, ceremonial space, hemmed in by imperial walls. Those walls were dismantled. The square was expanded violently and grandly to become one of the largest public plazas in the world. Massive Soviet-influenced edifices rose along its edges. The Great Hall of the People and the Museum of Chinese History were completed by 1959, standing as monuments to a new era. Then came the debate over the city's greatest relic, the Ming city walls. These 60 kilometers of multi-layered brick and earth, among the most impressive defensive works in the world, became the subject of one of the 20th century's great conservation battles. The visionary architect Liang Xicheng argued passionately for their preservation. His proposal was elegant. Keep the entire ring of walls as a continuous necklace of elevated parks. Build the new administrative capital on open land to the west, and leave the historic city center intact as a living museum. The plan was considered, but ultimately rejected. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s, the walls were dismantled in stages. The second ring road was eventually laid down directly atop their footprint. Only a few gate towers survived, spared by luck, by frantic last-minute lobbying, or by strategic ambiguity in the demolition orders. They stand today like isolated fragments, amidst a sea of asphalt, still carrying the invisible weight of the walls they once anchored. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution brought further ruptures. Temples were repurposed into factories or warehouses. Traditional neighborhoods were threatened, and the city's cultural heart was effectively put into a coma for years. When the ideological storms finally subsided, after 1978, Beijing looked at what remained and chose a new path: breakneck growth at any cost. The reform era turned Beijing into a construction site of staggering proportions. Ring roads multiplied like ripples in a pond. The third, fourth, and fifth rings were built in rapid succession, each one encircling a city significantly larger than the one before it. Migrant workers from every province flooded in, drawn by the gravity of a city growing faster than anyone had predicted. The construction crane became the city's national bird, a permanent fixture of the skyline. The smell of coal smoke, which had defined Beijing winters for centuries, was slowly replaced by the scent of diesel and the chemical haze of a mega-metropolis trapped in a poorly ventilated basin. Then the Hutong's times began to disappear. These ancient neighborhoods, which had survived dynasties, were demolished by the mile to make room for glass towers and luxury apartments. The bulldozers moved with terrifying efficiency. The 2008 Olympics served as both a catalyst and a turning point. A decade's worth of infrastructure was compressed into a few years. The subway system exploded from 2 lines to over a dozen. But this destruction triggered something the planners hadn't fully anticipated: a genuine grassroots heritage movement. Scholars and residents began documenting what was being lost. Today, sometimes Hutong Times districts are preserved, but here the story gets complicated. Many have been Disneyfied, gutted and rebuilt as pristine tourist zones. The original residents are displaced, the alleys are scrubbed clean, and the courtyards are turned into boutique hotels. The physical form survives, but the living community is gone. Conservation and commercialization have become almost impossible to untangle. Now, if you stand at the center of it all at Tiananmen Gate and look north toward the Forbidden City, then turn south across the vast square, you realize the historical core is a tiny island in a concrete ocean. Zoom out. 6 ring roads, high-speed rails stretching to Tianjin, Shanghai, and Harbin. The government is moving administrative functions east to the new district of Tongzhou. Planners now speak of Jingjinji, a megalopolis integrating Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei into a single urban unit of over 100 million people. And yet, in the middle of a highway interchange, that Ming Gate Tower still stands. It looks slightly ridiculous, surrounded by speeding Audis and neon signs, yet it remains majestic. The surviving gates, most notably Zhengyangmen, are the final intact witnesses to this entire saga. They have seen Mongol architects trace the grid of a medieval dream. They stood while the Ming built around them, the Qing reorganized them, and the Republic opened them to the masses. They watched as the revolution cleared the square beneath them, and the Olympic cameras panned over them. Today, the city tries to reclaim the past. It once tried to erase, restoring silted canals and expanding Hutong Times protection zones, while simultaneously building AI research hubs on the outer rings. The tensions are real: water scarcity, air quality, and the haunting question of who gets to live in the historic center and who is pushed 40 kilometers out to the fringes. But here is the final surprise, and it is a quiet one. The city is now so large that many residents on the outer rings live closer to neighboring cities than to the Forbidden City at the center. The ancient idea of a metropolis organized around a sacred imperial core has become geographically meaningless to millions. Looking down from above, across 22 million people, and the endless sprawl of glass and smog, you see 3,000 years of choices compressed into a single frame. A border garrison became a trade post, a warlord's prize, an imperial dream, a Mongol masterpiece, a Ming fortress, a Qing empire, a republic, a revolution, and finally, a megacity. Through every fire, every looting, every occupation, and every revolution, the people stayed. Picture an 80-year-old Beijing local standing quietly by the Zhengyangmen Gate as the traffic roars past. He leans toward his grandson and speaks over the noise. "My grandparents used to tremble when they heard the Japanese shells outside the walls." The boy looks up, eyes wide, as the old man continues. "And your great-grandmother," she cried, "the day we had to leave our old Hutong to make way for the highway. It felt like the world was ending." The old man pauses, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. But look around you, boy. Despite it all, we are still here. That is the heartbeat of Beijing. The people are not just witnesses to history. They are the reason the city survives. The history of Beijing isn't a story of bricks and mortar. It is a testament to the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people who chose to stay, chose to rebuild, and chose to pass on hope even when the world was collapsing around them. In a world of frantic change, this city reminds us that true heritage doesn't lie in stone. It lies in the capacity to rise, over and over again. Take that lesson into your own life. Cherish the past, but use it as a foundation to build a better future for those who follow. History isn't just a dusty book, it is the fire that lights our path today. If the story of Beijing touched your heart today, if it made you want to tell your own children about the power of persistence, share this video with your family and friends right now. And if you are curious about another city with a history just as transformative and strange, comment the name of the place you want me to explore next. Let's discover these stories together, because history doesn't just belong to the past, it is shaping exactly how we live right now. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you on our next journey through time.